The way this is going to work is we're going to talk about each of the three bills very briefly, then some other folks are going to speak about the bills, and then we'll be happy to answer any questions. So I would like to first introduce Senator Anthony Polina.
I guess as a basic introduction to what we're talking about here is the idea of that it's time to find ways to build a better budget for the state and take a new look at our economic development policies. And we all know that the economy is changing in very big and very important ways and very permanent ways, and that we're seeing inequality reach its greatest level since the Great Depression. Good jobs are disappearing, more people are falling into poverty, many more people can't afford to buy a home or send their kids to college, retirement savings are disappearing, and we're beginning to realize that business as usual isn't working anymore, and simply cutting services and cutting budgets, if it means more of a burden on working families and vulnerable Vermonters, if it means we underfund environmental protection and social programs, that kind of business as usual is not working anymore. Neither is the idea that we continue to send all of our tax dollars, hard-earned tax dollars, down to Wall Street while Vermonters struggle to make ends meet right here at home, and frankly the banks on Wall Street don't care a whole lot about Vermont or Vermonters. Even when we talk about a balanced budget, which we do in Vermont, which is a good thing, don't get me wrong, balancing the budget is a good thing to do, but it can sometimes give us a false sense of security. Because if we're balancing the budget, but what we're really doing is balancing it at the expense of middle-class families or vulnerable Vermonters, if we're balancing the budget, but we're doing it because we've put off the funding for cleanup of Lake Champlain and other environmental programs, that balanced budget gives us a false sense of security, because really what we're doing is putting off these costs for another day. So the new economic reality, we believe, means we need new economic tools in order to deal with it, to restore some equality, to strengthen our local economy, and to basically make sure that we have a stronger future. And that's why we talk about the theme of building a better budget. We are not, let's be clear, right now today, we're not talking about taking on the state budget this year. We're talking about changing the focus and the way we look at our budgeting process and the way we look at economic development. So the things we're talking about today are not for today, but they're for tomorrow, and they're for changing the debate over the state budget. I just want to mention briefly one of those tools, which is the Genuine Progress Indicator, or GPI. Now, it's an alternative to what we think of or what we know of as the gross domestic product, the GDP. The GDP measures what we make and what we buy. The GPI is different in the sense that it begins to put a value on things we really care about and things that we now usually ignore in the budget-making process. So the GPI talks about things that we value, things that we cherish, and things that we need. So it puts a value on factors that are now ignored. For instance, the cost of water pollution or the cost of inequality. These are costs that we need to confront now sooner rather than later. It also helps us put a value on things that are good for us, like good, strong families and safe communities and quality education and health care. So factors that are now ignored when we look at our state budget and our economic development policies and are ignored when we look at how our economy is doing would be considered if we use the GPI as the basis for our budgeting process. I want to mention one of the reasons why this came up. A couple of months ago, I was looking at a local newspaper, and one headline said that Vermont had one of the strongest gross domestic products in the country, which sounds good. Another headline in the same paper said demand at the food bank was up 30%. Another article a couple days later said median family income had dropped. So what it shows you is that the GDP is out of touch with the reality for most Vermonters and most people. It doesn't make sense anymore given the economy that we live in. And again, what we want to do is use the GPI to reshape the budget debate. Essentially what the GPI would allow us to do is to go beyond the dollars when we talk about our budget. Basically talk about the things that are missing, the costs that we're putting off. Basically the idea again that we could claim to have a balanced budget when what we're really doing is increasing costs on working families and middle class families, or we say we balanced the budget when we have not done our work to clean up Lake Champlain and our waterways. That's what we mean by getting beyond the numbers when it comes to the budget, so that we can talk about the real value and really get a better idea of what our economic, our social, and our environmental well-being is. It's not just about things that we buy and things that we spend money on. It's about the things that we cherish. So including these factors would give us a better idea of where we are and would give us the basis, again, we believe, for building a better budget in the future. I would just mention as an aside that the state of Maryland does have a GPI. We intend to develop a GPI that is better than the one in Maryland. Ours would integrate more factors to be included. It would also tie it to human rights principles, and we would make sure that the GPI was actually used as a factor in developing the state budget. I do have a little bit of information that I could share with you later if anybody's interested, but the GPI in Maryland is online. You can see it, and you can get a sense of how it works. And most of the work done around the GPI in Maryland has been done by people affiliated with the Gunn Institute for Ecological Economics here in the state of Vermont. They would certainly be involved in the work that we're doing on our GPI here. So that the GPI, or genuine progress indicator, is one of the ways that we can reshape the debate over our state budget and get a better, more clear idea of what our real social and economic and environmental well-being is behind the dollars, to look at the things that are really important to us as a community.
Thank you. The second bill that we're going to talk about is a bill I refer to as the 1-to-8 ratio, or fair compensation bill. One of the biggest issues in the U.S. today is the growing income inequality, the increasing gap between the bottom and the top wage earners. Middle and working class incomes have been essentially flat for several decades, as we know, while a tiny percentage of Americans are getting richer and richer. By some estimates, the average American CEO makes almost 400 times the salary of the average American worker. To put this in context, this means if you make $15 an hour, your CEO would be making $6,000 an hour. This is not an accident, but a result of national economic policies. But what can we do about it in Vermont? More specifically, what can state government do? Does the state have a role to play in addressing this income disparity? Our answer is yes. We cannot tell a business or a nonprofit institution what they can pay their employees, but we can say economic justice matters to us. Your salary spread matters to us because a huge income gap signals an unhealthy economy. We want all Vermonters to earn a livable wage, and we in state government have a responsibility to spend the state's limited resources where they can have the greatest impact. Therefore, we have introduced H. 549. H. 549 would restrict state appropriations to those entities, nonprofit and for-profit, that have no greater than a 1-to-8 ratio between lowest and highest paid employees. In other words, if your highest paid employee makes $160,000, your lowest paid employee has got to make at least $20,000 in order for your organization or business to be eligible for state funds. If your highest paid staff makes $300,000 salary, then your lowest paid employee has got to make $37,500. The exact ratio is obviously not the point, by the way, but 1-to-8 is not an unrealistic or impossible ratio. All state employees fall within this 1-to-8 spread. It is my hope that we can embrace our role in determining social and economic policy and take a stand against income inequality by passing this bill. And the next bill we want to talk about is a state bank bill.
There's been discussion about, well, first of all, I want to mention, just as an aside again, the diversity of people that have come together around these programs. You have people from the Gunn Institute for Ecological Economics at UVM, and you got the Vermont Workers Center, along with environmental groups and consumer groups, because everybody understands the need to begin to have a budget and a budget process that really reflects what's important to Vermonters. The proposals to do the state bank would essentially set up, in a sense, a study, but one that would come back to recommending a structure for a state bank. And the concept is simple if we look at what has happened, at least in the state of North Dakota. Now, we can't make a real comparison with North Dakota. It's a different economy, and they have a state bank that's been around a long time. But what the state bank in Vermont would allow us to do is to keep our tax dollars in the state of Vermont so that they can be used to stimulate our economy in a way that meets our priorities. The other things to keep in mind with having a state bank is the ability to be charged lower rates for the use of the bank, receive higher interest. In North Dakota, the state bank at the end of the year actually returns about $40 million to the general fund of the state of North Dakota. Now, that's money that would have normally gone into the pockets of the shareholders of Bank of America or whoever else would have, handled that money for the state. So if we can have our own state bank, we'd be able to better direct our resources, make sure more of our dollars stay here at home, be able to bank at a lower cost to the state, and then be able to reap the profit that would normally go to an international or multinational bank, but money that would be handled by ourselves, so we get to keep more of that profit here in the state. There are a couple of ways to do it, and we're not going to get into that right now, but we're not talking about necessarily a bank building down on the corner of State and Main where you would go down and you would open up a checking account or a savings account or a Christmas club. It's a bank that would be, in a sense, a banker's banker, most likely. Actually, one thing I want to mention very, very much is that it would also work in support of local community banks to help them with their lending priorities. So it's not an attack or in any way meant to supplement or to replace local community-based banks. It's a way to keep our dollars here locally, have our priorities be attended to, support local banks in their lending activities, and make sure that more of our resources, again, stay here in the state of Vermont. There's no reason why we should collect our tax dollars and then deposit that money in some multinational bank that couldn't care less about the state of Vermont or our priorities. We can keep that money closer to home and direct it towards our own personal, not our own personal, but our own community needs. I'm going to mention one other thing. Because there actually are 4 bills that we're touching on today, and that was a mistake on our part when we introduced ourselves. There's a bill in the Senate which would essentially move towards greater use of more contracting towards Vermont businesses and Vermont products. So whether we're buying potatoes, or whether we're building a building, or whether we're contracting for professional services, again, what we want to see is more of our dollars used to support local businesses and local products. Now, we talk about that a lot in Vermont. We always talk about buying local, but if you look very closely, you find that the state could do a much better job at buying local than it does right now. So what we're talking about doing is using the market power of the state to stimulate activity with Vermont businesses, Vermont producers, and Vermont professional contractors, architects and engineers, potato growers, or builders. Whether, we talk about building green projects, green energy projects. We also know there's been a lot of controversy about why the turbines being built in Vermont are not necessarily being built by Vermonters. We talk about a lot of contracting that goes on by state government. Those contracts should go to Vermonters first. We talk about the state of Vermont goes to a lot of hamburger at our institutions. We should be buying that hamburger from Vermonters. And again, we give lip service to this all the time, but we do not do a good job of actually doing it. We propose using an econometric model. It's a computer model that the state already uses that would make sure that contracting decisions were made in what's called the best interest of the state of Vermont. And the best interest of the state of Vermont is most likely, in most cases, going to be hiring Vermonters, because that's generating Vermont jobs, they pay Vermont taxes, and they raise Vermont families. So we want to see the econometric model used to make those contracting decisions here in the state of Vermont. Sorry about that.
These bills have a lot of support from other legislators, but I want to just briefly introduce Chris Pearson, who is a Burlington rep and chair of the Progressive Caucus of the House.
Thanks, Susie. I support these bills. I'm proud to be here today to speak in support of them. When you think about what's happened in our country and our economy over the last 5+ years, you see a housing sector that's collapsed, leaving people who've been paying their mortgages on the street and in foreclosure. We see an increased dialogue, a welcome dialogue about the incredible inequality in our economy, be it mostly on income side, but certainly on the tax and revenue side as well. And I think very rightly, you have citizens looking to government and looking to the system and say, this is badly broken. This does not reflect our values, and what can we do with it? And it is such a systematic problem, and these bills, if we enact them today, does not make all of that go away. But what we're trying to do is to begin to create tools that will help us get to the point where our economy is actually working for regular people, for average citizens, for working families, so that we can have a strong middle class, and most importantly, so that we have systems in our state government, which is, people get very freaked out about government. Government is simply a form of community, of an organization within our community. It is supposed to reflect ourselves. And it's important that that system reflects the well-being of our citizens, and we're trying to employ some tools that will move us in that direction. So I want to applaud these folks for taking the leadership initiative, and I'm happy to support it and give you my full support. Thanks.
John Moran, Representative John Moran of Wardsboro, is the chair of the Working Vermonters Caucus.
I'm specifically going to speak about the 8-to-1 ratio. It's no mystery that there's great economic inequality in our country right now, and it's time for us to deal with that inequality. To close the gap between the affluent and those who really create the wealth in our country, it is time for us to do that. This is a simple bill. It just sets an 8-to-1 ratio that the highest paid and the lowest paid in any organization, corporation, nonprofit that deals directly with the state would have to meet that requirement to work in our state. I think this is an opportunity for us to start the process of creating economic equality in the state of Vermont, and therefore I support not only this bill, but all the other bills that have been pushed forward here today. Thank you.
Thank you, John. There's a lot of support for the state bank idea. This is a study, by the way. The bill would not create a state bank. The bill creates a study that would look at the pros and cons of the state bank. And the Gund Institute has been working very hard on it, and as is the Vermont Economic Advisory Policy Group. Is that the correct name, Gwen? I'd like to introduce Gwen Halsmith. You can correct the name.
Thanks. Thank you, Susie and Anthony. And I'd just like to applaud your efforts on all of these bills. I think they make a lot of sense. I'm here in my capacity as the author of a book called Creating Wealth, which is actually about monetary policy, and the convener of the Vermont Monetary Policy Advisory Group. You can't build a better budget for the state without understanding how money works, how financing works, how the different ways that money comes into our state and leaves our state affect real Vermonters in real ways. So we've been looking at a variety of policies that can be introduced. We've been meeting since last summer, and the state bank is one of the critical parts of that. We hope to look at this study and understand the way money works in the state, look at all the financing mechanisms that are available for both public and private investment, and come up with some recommendations for a plan that can really put the power over the money creation function in the state back in the hands of the people, where it belongs. Thank you.
Tom Barefoot is the founder and co-coordinator of the Gross National Happiness USA organization, which has been looking at ways to shift our measures of progress from economic to well-being.
So we're here to support the measures that we've heard this morning, in particular the GPI measure. We've been working with the Gund Institute as a partner for some time and are working also with the state administration and with the legislature in helping to craft, and we hope to implement, measures of well-being. Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, liked to say, what you measure is what you get, so you better be sure you're measuring what you want to get. If we want well-being for our people, and I think delivered well-being is really what we're talking about measuring directly, do the people actually feel better off tomorrow, a year from now? Maybe we'll have report cards that show how people are doing in different communities, something that their representatives can talk about and use to spark debate and interest in the communities about how we are going to achieve increased well-being in an age of difficulty and inequality. And for inequality, I'm going to put on this hat which says the wealth cap. This is an Occupy movement piece, and we feel strongly that there's real evidence that shows that inequality creates less well-being in the population at large, and that includes the well-off as well as the not well-off, and that increasing equality increases that well-being throughout the entire society. So we really ought to be looking at that. And we also need to recognize greed as a mental illness, and we need to educate and campaign against greed in the same way that we educated and campaigned against drunk driving or smoking in public places. So let's get on with working for more well-being and less inequality in our state. Thank you all, and we're very happy to be here to support this.
Jeff Briggs is the Vice President of the Vermont State Employees Association. He's the chair of the Legislation Committee.
Yeah, hi. The Vermont State Employees Association is happy to support H549. I can't think of a bigger issue that's impacted Vermont state employees and all workers in the state than the issue of income inequality. And our members have directly paid for the massive transfer of wealth in this society from the working class to the upper income, and we've all heard about that today, and we all know what it is. Our members have directly paid for that with reduced wages, lost jobs, an inability to provide state services because we don't have enough workers in the workforce, and you know, cutbacks in public services and in our wages and our ability to provide for our families and a equitable living standard. And so we're completely in support of this bill. And I want to give you one example from state government, because you heard Susie mention that within state government we are within the confines of the 8-to-1 ratio of the highest paid officer in state government. The governor doesn't make more than 8 times the lowest paid employee, and so we do have an equitable workforce. But that's only part of the story. The other part of the story is that the state of Vermont contracts out a significant portion of its work to private companies, and that part of the state expenditures, there's virtually very little oversight and very little accountability, and this bill would directly address some accountability in contracting out. And I'm going to give you one example, and that's Corrections Corporation of America, which you probably all heard us talk about this before, but not only are our jobs of Vermont state workers being outsourced to Corrections Corporation of America, but Corrections Corporation of America has a CEO who makes $3 million a year. And I would venture to guess that the lowest paid employee of Corrections Corporation of America is probably $15,000 or $20,000 or $10,000 a year. So you do the math, but it's way more than 8-to-1. The state of Vermont shouldn't be doing business with companies like this unless they can take some steps to get a more equitable compensation and address this issue. So this is one area where this bill would address, and it's a simple bill, and we support it. Thank you.
Our last formal speaker is Sandy Gaffney from the Vermont Workers Center.
Hi, I'm Sandy Gaffney, and I'm involved with the Vermont Workers Center now. I was involved with Mobile Home Park Residents for Equality and Fairness after the flood in August. After the flood happened, I started to realize that the things that I thought about before the flood were even more important, because there is a lot of things happening and have been happening for a long time that make it very hard for me and folks like me to survive and to be able to have a comfortable life in our wonderful state. In calling for, talking about the Vermont Workers Center and calling for a people's budget, the Vermont Workers Center is calling for this budget intended to ensure that the fundamental human needs of every Vermonter are met. And they are not being met right now, and they haven't been met for decades. The requirement to meet human needs is a reflection of government's inalienable obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill the human rights of every Vermonter. In order to achieve government that puts people first, government that strengthens our communities instead of allowing wealth to be concentrated in the pockets of a tiny minority, we need to begin to treat our economic system as a public good. The private banking system, particularly as a result of 3 decades of deregulation and inadequate oversight, is not accountable to our communities. a state bank could become the basis for finance that serves the public good and allows for the kind of accountability that a stable financial system and the public interest require. For this same amount of time, we have seen the productivity of American workers rise, while the incomes of hardworking people has been stagnant and the middle class has shrunk. What we have seen is financial systems replacing economic systems and corporate CEOs being rewarded exorbitantly for behaviors that are destructive of our communities and of the economy itself. The issue is not whether these salaries are necessary to attract executive talent. The issue is whether Vermonters want to reward businesses that create jobs for working people or businesses that overpay their executives. If businesses that overpay their executives are threatened by H549, then the logical way for them to respond would be to move toward economic justice. These three bills move Vermont in the direction of putting people first. They address the human rights principles of equity, accountability, and transparency. The members of the Vermont Workers Center support these efforts and efforts like them. Thank you.
We have people also who will not speak, but just want to let you all know there are representatives here from Vermont Natural Resources Council, from the Gund Institute, from Occupy, and no doubt others.
We'll try to answer, any of us will try to answer any questions you might have. I would say one thing, that put it in a lingo that you hear around the State House a lot, what we're talking about here is results-based budgeting. We're just talking about a different kind, we want a better result, and we want to know that we're investing in a way that's going to get us to the result that we're all looking for as a community. I would just mention again, for those who are interested, I do have a little bit of material that will explain to you how the state of Maryland, in their GPI, puts values on the things that we're talking about. They actually they know how to value changes in family dynamics, or loss, they put a value on inequality or underemployment. There are numbers that can be attached to these things. The data is there. The data is in Vermont as well. So it's not a difficult process. In case I don't want you to walk away with the impression that this is a hard thing to do, because it's not.
Any questions?
Any questions?
Yeah, do you have support from the Democratic leadership in the House and the Senate for legislation?
In terms of the folks I've talked to in this, I've talked about it with the leadership in the Senate, and I have met with members of the administration about the GPI I'm talking about now. And I think there's a great deal of openness to it.
How about the others?
We debated and almost passed a bill to increase the state purchase, not a bill, but it was part of a bill last year to increase state purchasing of contracting with Vermonters. We came close to that. Clearly that needs more debate, but there is support for that in the Senate as well. I honestly don't think I've had conversations about the state bank much with folks. What they will tell you is that we've studied, I can't speak for this, I was not here at the time, but the Senate, and I assume the House, this is not the first time they've been asked to look at a state bank. But so I have mentioned to some individuals who have said, well, we looked at that once or twice before, but then they immediately say, but you know, things have been changing a lot in the economy recently, maybe it's worth looking at again. So we've had the conversations.
Did the state purchasing, you said there was debate last year, did that make it out of committee?
Basically, it was part, originally it was part of the jobs bill last year, and it was removed at the last minute in part because it was seen it would take an appropriation of $30,000 to set up the model. And ironically, what we did is, instead of spending the $30,000 to set up the model, in our wisdom, we allocated $30,000 to look at ways to set up models and to look at the benefits of more local contracting and ways in which we can improve our contracting. I think in hindsight, a lot of people think that was maybe not the best use of the money. I have no idea what resulted from that $30,000 that we allocated. This year, what we're just saying is just allocate the money to do the job instead of thinking about ways of doing it. So it was in a bill and it was removed during the committee process.
And then the 8-to-1, have you talked to the administration or House Representative leadership about that ratio?
Have talked with the House leadership. I would say, I think it would be fair to say there is sympathy with the idea and concern about the implementation.
And I think there is generally a growing awareness that, as I said before, that the way we're doing the budget now, or our economic policy, is not really working. You know, we continue to cut services, we continue to have a leaner and leaner budget, but the economy is not necessarily getting better. We're not putting more people to work. We're not seeing incomes increase. Vermont, inequality is increasing in Vermont faster than it is in every other state except one. So we have the second fastest rising rate of inequality in the country. There's also been a number of years over the last 6 years, I think at least twice, we had the largest declines in median family income of any state in the country. Another year we came in second. So we've seen a great increase in inequality here in Vermont. We've seen real significant declines in household income. I don't think there's any legislator that's not aware of that, but part of what we're doing here is making it more clear to people and now putting solutions on the table to address what is really the most significant problem we face as a state, which is we have an economy that's leaving a lot of people behind or shutting a lot of people out. And if you want the overall economy to get better, if you want to create jobs, if you want to strengthen our economy, you don't necessarily do that with tax credits or other kinds of policies. What businesses need to grow are customers. In order for businesses to have more customers, we have to put money in the pockets of working Vermonters so they can pay their bills, take care of their families, go downtown and buy a local pizza, support local businesses. That's how you strengthen the economy, and that's what these kinds of programs would do. We want to put money back in the pockets of Vermonters so we can strengthen our economy from the ground up and not try to mess around with it from the top down. And I think there's a general recognition of that.
Regarding the Bank of North Dakota, do any of you folks know what they're getting in terms of a return on equity and whether or not that's dependent on oil?
No.
The return on equity at the Bank of North Dakota is, for the 3-year period, 26%, 25%, and 19%. And no, it has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with oil, because that particular revenue flows into the private banks of North Dakota, and the Bank of North Dakota acts as the asset base so that those private banks can invest in whatever they want. I've heard oil doesn't come out of the ground and refine itself. It's the Bank of North Dakota that allows for that to happen in North Dakota as opposed to going to Wall Street, which is what all the other states have to do.
I also want
Jim Hogue, who's chair of the State Bank Committee.
Yes, state/public bank committee. Thank you.
I also want to caution people, having been involved in the healthcare debate for years in Vermont, we're not comparing ourselves to North Dakota when it comes to a state bank any more than we would compare ourselves to Canada or Germany when it comes to healthcare reform. We're talking about coming up with a model that works for Vermont. So it may be similar to, or it may not be similar to the way it's done in North Dakota. And that's why we want to see a group of people look at it and come back with a structure that works for Vermont. Last thing I would mention, if anybody's interested, at 1:30, which is any moment now, John Erickson from the Gund Institute is going to offer testimony to the Senate Government Operations Committee around the GPI bill, which is also another indication that there's a fair amount of interest in the bill and moving it through the Senate.
Thank you all very
Thanks a lot.
much for coming.